ontologist, substance implies domstance. Well, substance does, reply, standing under, or like, being under. So it literally does in a way. There we go. So we're going to start now. So, open your books if you got them, or it's right there on the screen. We're going to read the Monadology by Leibniz. It is in this book down here, section 29, the Principles of Philosophy, or the Monadology. What Leibniz was trying to do here was essentially condense his entire philosophical system down into a pretty short set of comprehensive statements of his philosophy. So there's something also a little bit, in some ways, difficult about this, because there's a lot going on and a lot packed into some small statements, but we can work through it, and it will be really helpful for us going forward. Because again, Kant's whole growing up was in Prussia, which is, modern day Germany. Well, actually, where Kant lived is modern day Russia, actually, but, he was German. This was the philosophical world. Leibniz was the big dog, and that was the philosophical world that Kant grew up in. So it's hugely important in his philosophical beliefs. So some key terms for the class. First of all, a monad, and we've got it defined for us right there in the first proposition. And this is going to be crucial for us, not only obviously for understanding Leibniz's to himself most important concept, but concept also very important for Kant. The monad, right? Of course, the root is one, right? Mono audio, what are some other words that use this root? It is a simple substance without parts, right? Why is Leibniz doing this? Yes, monads are an extended, Raven. Yes, we'll get there in a second. I'm just going as we go to the text, but yes, you're exactly right. And that's already a huge thing, right? I want to address something right now that is important, right? So there's, like I mentioned, there's the three big rationalists: René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And they're all, in one way or another, believe that metaphysics can be grounded through reason, right? You can find a pure, rational principle upon which to build everything else, as opposed to the empiricists. We'll talk about them later. Descartes believed that extension, and I also want to right now, because we're focused on, like Heidegger just said in our intro, not with defining how these terms are defined now, all the ways we might define them, understanding what they meant, in what sense they were a concern for Leibniz and his peers. For Descartes, extension is something's having width, length, etc. Now, what does that mean, right? What it means is that what we are, yes, exactly, res extensa, as ontologists said, which is Latin for extended thing, right? That's what our body is, according to Descartes, right? What we are, according to Descartes, is a mind, right? And what a mind is is essentially one-dimensional, right? Remember that, this is kind of basic, like middle school math, but right, one-dimensional is like just the like x coordinates or whatever, right? If you add another coordinate, then you can have two-dimensional, three-dimensional, blah, blah, blah. Once we gain dimensions, right, add those second and third and fourth dimensions, we have extension, right? And that's our bodies. But what we are fundamentally is just the mind for Descartes. The body is just the extension of our mind, right? Leibniz has a problem with this. So this is not what extension means for Leibniz. He's going to the first section right now is going to be essentially answering critiquing Descartes' way of framing extension. Frank, if monads are infinitesimal, then there are infinite monads, and it is some way silly to talk about them at all. There are not infinite monads, according to Leibniz. This is very important, so we'll come back to this. Yeah, Descartes was very familiar with coordinate systems because they are called the Cartesian grids, right? And it's called that because it's his name. No worries, Frank. Calabra, I read that an issue for Leibniz in the late 1690s was how Aristotelian the nature of substance was for him, so he grappled and developed it further into what it is here. Yeah, totally. Aristotle was so hugely influential in medieval Europe and into early modern Europe and early modern philosophy in Europe that he wasn't even referred to by the name Aristotle. He was just referred to by the name the philosopher, right? The philosopher is Aristotle. And Aristotle has a conception of substance. I was going to talk about that later, but you know what? We can talk about that now. So this is a crucially important word for Aristotle, substance, right? A certain question that goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, and that's still going on early modern, and really in a lot of ways is still going on today, is the question of what is the fundamental stuff of the universe, right? You could say, right, something that's somewhat closer to, although it's not quite the same thing we mean by it today, but something like Democritus's view that, which is where the word comes from, the world is fundamentally made up of atoms, small particles, right? Aristotle's fundamental thing is quite a bit bigger because it's essentially a natural kinds. It's like biological entities, right? You can break those down, but the fundamental substance are these fundamental kinds that he identifies. And a substance is formed matter for Aristotle. So it has an entelecheia, it has a principle that structures it into the being that it is, the substance. And it also has a sort of, the word here is teleological, meaning it is progressive, and it's developing purposively toward an end, right? It has a perfect form that it's moving towards. So you can be on different stages of your teleological progression, but all things have a certain push towards something, right? And the way that I can't remember, maybe it was Kapar, someone earlier alluded to this, but yeah, I don't want to go too deep into the Aristotle stuff right now, but how Aristotle kind of works out how we figure out these things is you ask what is said of or not said of, or present in or not present in, so you can distinguish between substance and accident. So you have something like, you might say a substance, or an example of a substance is apple, and it might have accidents, or we could call them properties, or Leibniz is going to use the word qualities in here, like redness, for instance, the color red, right? The red is not a substance. It's something that's said of, it's something that's present in substances, for example. So that's some important background to this. Energy, what is the difference, if any, between a monad and an atom in the sense of the Greek atomus of something which is indivisible? We will get to that in the text. But I can at least give you one quick answer now. A huge problem, there's something even called Leibniz's law, which is that no two beings, this is Leibniz's law, basically, not the exact wording of it. No two beings can have all the exact same properties, right? For instance, this is the example I used when I was talking about this a week ago. If you can have the description Donald Trump and the description President of the United States, right? Those refer to the exact same being, right? Because those two beings both have all the exact same properties, right? So they have to be the same thing. According to Leibniz, whether you think he's right or wrong about this, the conception of atoms is incoherent because they are described as having all the exact same properties. So it would be nonsense to talk about there being more than one atom when they all have the exact same properties. But he actually does talk about that pretty soon in the text. K-Pars, I've heard it explained as properties need to exist in a substance, but substance doesn't need anything else. It just is. It has a propensity. Yeah, exactly. A substance is what properties adhere to a substance. I mean, substance is kind of defined negatively in that way. It's like a thing which properties apply to or are added to. K-Pars, if you made a clone of me, it would be in a different location. Can't have all the same properties. So that's actually Leibniz, right? That's what I think a lot of people would say. This is one of Leibniz's weirdnesses, is that he rejects that. He does not consider being in a different location significant enough to count as a different being. One of Leibniz's weirdest claims, and he has a lot of weird claims, is that you cannot use being in two different places as counting as a genuine difference. But so monad is a simple substance without parts, right? The monadology, he's trying to basically build his entire philosophical system. So by the time we get to the end of this, we're going to be talking about God and ontology and everything. But we're starting with what is the universe fundamentally made of, right? One option, like we talked about, could be atoms. Another option could be a kind of Aristotelian substance, right? Like individual beings, individual entities. For Leibniz, it's going to be these things called monads. He hasn't defined anything about us yet. In the first one, he's just said they are a simple substance without parts. And I understand what you mean, Soch, now about being, what does it mean without parts? He's going to explain that right here. So number 2, and there must be simple substances since there are composites. For the composite is nothing more than a collection or aggregate of simples, right? So that's step 2, right? And think about this. You can think about this as like a very simple example, right? Like pick up, I can pick up this coffee mug and I can see that there's the mug and there's the coffee inside, and I could pour the coffee out and then I could have coffee somewhere else. We were just talking about substance. So Leibniz just said in the second one that there's composites, right? And I was just giving an example of how you can look at something like the coffee in your mug and you can see that it can break down into 2 parts, right? And you can extend that, a lot. I was going to say ad infinitum, but that's really important that it's not infinite. To think about breaking things down into their smaller parts, right? The point is that for Leibniz, there has to fundamentally be something that you eventually get to. That's the bedrock substance that can't be broken down any further. That's what a monad is, right? You can make all kinds of composite substances, right? So for Leibniz, we can have substances that are both composites and monads, but for those composites to exist, they have to be built out of fundamental parts. They can't be infinitely divisible. That's also we were talking earlier about how Leibniz has a huge problem with Descartes' idea that body is just the extension of mind, right? But if that's true, Leibniz thinks, then body will be infinitely divisible and it will have no fundamental substance. And so the ground of metaphysics will be nothingness, right? So that can't be right. Frank, why would extension imply infinite divisibility? You could add an extra dimension that just had two indivisible possible positions. Because for Descartes, the fundamental one dimension is mind, right? Body is infinitely divisible because body is not one-dimensional. Body is once you add to mind, which is the first dimension, the second dimension, the third dimension of, extension, length, height, whatever, right? But, mind is something immaterial, right? So the material world is going to be infinitely divisible because you can't take it back to the one-dimensional point. We're sticking true to the ongoing joke of philosophy speedruns that, we call it a speedrun, but it's the slowest reading of a text you've ever seen. But we're gonna get through a lot today. 3. But where there are no parts, neither extension nor shape nor divisibility is possible. These monads are the true atoms of nature and, in brief, the elements of things, right? Because once you extend into those additional dimensions beyond the one point, right, that's when you can start talking about cutting it up into smaller pieces. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, Ivan. Unless you have a theory that's like string theory in which strings are extended yet indivisible and fundamental. I've made it my official position, as I've said on stream, my official rationally considered position that I will not talk about physics on stream because I lack the relevant expertise to be able to say something smart about it. So I can't say to what extent. I guess I'm technically talking about physics right now, but I am not going to talk about quantum mechanics on stream. But what I guess if you feel like sharing, Ivan, what would be right? That's if Leibniz heard that, he would just say, well, the theory's wrong because obviously that can't be the case, right? What would you do? How would you respond to Ivan? To Leibniz to convince him that he's wrong and he should believe in string theory. Ivan, I think what he is saying was self-evident, but he does not see that the alternative is not contradictory. The question, of course, is string theory right? If string theory is right, then sure, that disproves Leibniz. But if it's not, then it doesn't. And so this, you would say, Ivan, is where Leibniz makes a mistake already. I remember you saying in 3, he already makes a mistake. And your basis for saying he makes a mistake would be that string theory is an example that shows how it would be possible to have extension, shape, and divisibility without parts. I don't know, I have to think more about this. Number 4, there is also no dissolution to fear, and there is no conceivable way in which a simple substance can perish naturally. So this is an important point. For Leibniz, this is a little bit like, you die, and you live on because, your body decomposes and then it's like in the soil, that kind of thing. Because, right, everything that dies is not a monad. Monads don't die, but composites die in the sense that the composite gets pulled apart and the different pieces, the different monads get put into other pieces, right? So that's how you have this claim that a simple substance never dissolves, right? It's permanent for all time, right? Composites come and go. There's change in the universe, but the monads are permanent. Von Leibniz's substances are more akin to forces than things anyway. They're not extended, but that doesn't make extension unreal. So I actually found this. I posted it in the Discord. There's apparently a debate in the secondary literature on Leibniz. Some scholars hold that Leibniz's view is that the monads are the only thing that's real, right? And in that sense, all the extension is just, phenomenal. It's just an idea, an illusion, but the only true reality is the monads. The other position in the scholarship is that, yes, the monads are what is most real, but everything else it's a composite of monads, so it has reality within it. So that's actually, I guess, a point of debate in the scholarship. Frank, if position is a property, then a monad could move and die. Is this why position isn't a property? That's a good point. Probably. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think you're right. Right. If Leibniz admitted position as a property, like we talked about earlier, right? It doesn't count as distinguishing if things have all the other same properties otherwise, but are in two different places. That doesn't count for Leibniz as true discernibility. I think you're right? Then a monad, every time it moved in a certain way, would be dying, right? Because all its properties are internal to it. Yeah, I think you're right, Frank. That's well said. 5 follows similarly from this. The concept of a graduation of the real is consistent with theory in Leibniz's time. Descartes granted a more and a less to reality. Right, that could be a case in point of the latter reading, that generally speaking it was not an uncommon view in Leibniz's time and world. But the support for the opposite is that Leibniz does basically say word for word the substances are just merely phenomenal. But yeah, I mean, there's a good reason to think he doesn't mean that as a diminishment of reality. Yeah, Frank, you think there's a cheat in here, but it could be one of several things, so I don't know which is the problem. Fair. So 5, for the same reason there is no conceivable way a simple substance can begin naturally, since it cannot be formed by composition, right? Substances are not, monads are not created and they're not destroyed, right? Every monad that ever has been or ever will be already exists, always has, and always will. Right, that's Leibniz's position. 6, thus one can say that monads can only begin or end all at once. That is, they can only begin by creation and end by annihilation, where composites begin or end through their parts. There is also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature. I see what you mean, Frank. If position isn't a property and relationship to other monads isn't a property, I think you are just defining away obvious properties in a silly way. I see what you mean. But at the same time, right, it's not that uncommon for us to, like, when we hold up a mug and say, what are the properties of this mug? We might say, it's like pink, it has a handle of a certain, we don't usually say it has the property of being in, not going to dox myself, where I live, being this amount of height above. We don't usually think of that as a property, actually, in just an everyday way. 7. There is also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature, since one cannot transpose anything in it, nor can one conceive of any internal motion that can be excited, directed, augmented, or diminished within it, as can be done in composites, where there can be change among the parts. An important thing also that, the birth of philosophy, if we mean by that ancient Greek philosophy, is so absolutely inseparable from the birth of geometry, and the birth of geometry essentially comes from the discovery of ratios, which comes from music, right? So I don't know if this is true or not, but I can't help but see augmented or diminished, which are types of chords, and see how this kind of harmony of geometry and music and astrology also, in the sense of all this sense of measurement and geometry and harmony at work here. And here's Gomobo's favorite line: the monads have no windows through which something can enter or leave, right? So if you imagine this, right? I said this last time, and imagine this is, again, like I will sometimes do, I will give examples to help you understand a concept, but the example is not right, okay? We just understand it, and then we throw the example away. As Wittgenstein said, it's a ladder to help us get up, but once you're up, you kick the ladder away. But a monad, you could think of it like you're inside a monad, you're inside a Gundam or whatever, right? You're controlling your robot. Of course, there's not a person inside the monad. That's why this example doesn't work. But imagine you were, and this is helpful because we're trying to imagine how Wittgenstein getting OSHA fines. Well, I think he would, right? I mean, he's after Wittgenstein finished the Tractatus, he decided that he had solved philosophy. He later realized, like, oh shit, there's still problems I didn't figure out. But he thought at first he'd solved philosophy, and he was like, he didn't know what to do. And one thing he did for a while was he taught math to like grade schoolers, and he got in big trouble because apparently the students actually kind of liked him, but he would like hit students when they got problems wrong, and even like hit one student really hard to the point that it caused some health issues, I think. So it seems very accurate that Wittgenstein would end up getting OSHA fines. Frank says, if someone took two basically identical mugs and switched or didn't switch them behind their back, you couldn't know which was which. What does it mean to call them not the same thing if you can't distinguish them? So one thing here, I mean, I think it's fair to say, I'm not necessarily to say Leibniz is right, and I'm not suggesting, right, that we can't think of position as a property. But although I was only saying with the mug to say, although we might decide that Leibniz is wrong to exclude position from property, it isn't a totally crazy, thing. In fact, usually when we talk about it, we don't think of it that way, right? It's true that in a way a mug is a good example, because I don't want to drink your coffee, I want to drink my coffee, right, or something. And so that could be a reason to think of them as being relevant distinction, position. Of course, what I care about in that sense, perhaps, is the chemical composition. If we were in some hyper-controlled experiment where the mugs really were exactly identical, that once you've drank the coffee and I've drank my coffee, you've got your backwash in the coffee and I've got mine, so that's the properties that distinguish it, or something like that. But I think, Leibniz, in terms of if I try to imagine how Leibniz would respond to your question or criticism, Frank, I think he would probably say that I mean, if they were truly identical, then yes, there would be no difference between them. But of course, when we're talking in the real world, they're not gonna, no two mugs are gonna be exactly identical. But he's talking about how things are, built out of monads, and it's gonna have to be the case that the two different mugs in the world are built out of different monads, right? It's quite abstract, even though it's helpful to use real examples to kind of ground ourselves. I don't know. I mean, I think we can challenge Leibniz on this point, but yeah, great. Okay, let's keep reading. There is also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature, since one cannot transpose anything in it, nor can one conceive of any internal motion that can be excited, directed, augmented, or diminished within it, as can be done in composites, where there can be change among the parts. The monads have no windows through which something can enter or leave. So like I said, imagine you're inside the Gundam, the monad. There are no windows. And you can't ever leave either. You're always inside the monad. Accidents cannot be detached, nor can they go about outside of substances, as the sensible species of the scholastics once did. Thus, neither substance nor accident can enter a monad from without, right? You and anything else you have inside your Gundam are the only thing that ever has been or ever will be inside your Gundam. And that's true of every Gundam, right? That's what he's saying here, right? And so I mentioned earlier, right, why Leibniz would not be down with an atomistic theory like Democritus or something, because that you would have identical atoms, right? You'd have identical things, whereas the accidents, even though they're said of the substance, they are still internal to the substance, right? Your Gundam has cup holders. That's important, dude. Imagine ordering your Taco Bell in the Gundam. That's the future world. That's the world the left wants, ordering Taco Bell in the Gundam. However, monads must have some qualities, otherwise they would not even be beings. Right, I mentioned this earlier. Composites would reduce to nothings if they had no qualities. So remember that qualities, the word he's using here is also the word that's sometimes called accident, or I deleted it for some reason. Like redness, or properties, right? He's using the word qualities, right? So this is actually something unique to Leibniz, that, as contrasted with some of his peers, right? That the monads, these basic substances, already have the qualities attached to them. Pull up to Taco Bell for a Baja Blast and telling them my Gundam has... True, and there's no way to order, right? You'd have to have the Taco Bell already inside your Gundam, or there's no way to get your Baja Blast. Shane, I don't think that we could get Taco Bell in the Gundam. How can we get nachos if there aren't windows? Oh, Shane just answered that right there. That's why I should keep reading before I respond. Well, yeah, so I should say, though, nothing enters or leaves your Gundam, but we're going to get there in a second. Every Gundam perceives every other Gundam. So there is perception. So we'll get to that in a second. Why doesn't the Gundam shoot Baja Blast? That would be cool, right? The Gundam just shoots it. Or, doing, what was it? Shotgunning the beer, right? The shotgunning beer out of a Gundam, right? That was my greatest talent. The only drinking related thing I was good at is I would always win shotgun contests. So I'll do the Gundam shotgun. And if simple substances did not differ at all, hypervigilant Gundams, yes, in their qualities, there would be no way of perceiving any change in things, since what there is in a composite can only come from its simple ingredients. And if the monads had no qualities, they would be indiscernible from one another, since they also do not differ in quantity, right? So the change in things, whether it's like you getting older, or more radically, you dying and, like I said, changing into a plants or the soil or whatever, right? The reason this change is possible, if the world is always made up of monads, there's never going to be any new ones. We're never going to lose any of the ones we had. How is change possible? Because those individual monads have different qualities, so when they enter into new arrangements, again, because they're not like atoms, they're not just like identical, right? Having no properties, they all have the properties already within them. You're obviously going to have a different thing, a different composite, when different monads, which all have different qualities, are organized together. As a result, assuming a plenum, right? A plenum meaning, the whole structure of things together. In motion, each place would always receive only the equivalent of what it already had, and one state of things would be indistinguishable from another. It is also necessary that each monad be different from each other. For there are never two beings in nature that are perfectly alike, two beings in which it is not possible to discover an internal difference, that is, one founded on an intrinsic denomination, right? So that's, we got ahead on this, so we can actually keep reading quickly, because we talked about this already, right? How, for Leibniz, right, as a basic principle, you can never have two beings that have all the exact same qualities. Leibniz revealing he operates by the conservation of motion. Gomo, the upcoming argument here where he has to find the principle of individuation for the monads, the thing that differentiates them from one another, and that this thing is perception, is simply not good enough. He doesn't give a reason why it must be perception. Well, okay, let's read it. And then I'll respond to that. I also take for granted that every created being... Thank you, Gomobo. I also take for granted that every created being, and consequently the created monad as well, is subject to change, and even that this change is continual in each thing, right? So there is a possibility of change internal to the monad, but It follows from what we have just said that the monad's natural changes come from an internal principle, since no external cause can influence it internally, right? So it's that teleological thing coming back again. The monad is, mechanistically in motion. It's already following its own laws, becoming itself, as someone like Nietzsche might say, fulfilling its own teleology to in accord with its own internal principle. But besides the principle of change, there must be diversity in that which changes, which produces, so to speak, the specification and variety of simple substances, right? They all have their own internal laws, but it's not there's different types of internal laws, right? It's not that they all have one internal law that they follow. This diversity must involve a multitude in the unity or in the simple. For since all natural change is produced by degrees, something changes and something remains. As a result, there must be a plurality of properties and relations in the simple substance, although it has no parts. Right? It can't be broken down into individual parts, right? It has all the parts within it, right? There is something a little like the kind of thing you start talking about in Christian theology or something, where it's like, there's the God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but they're not three different things. They're all one, but there's three aspects or something like that. I think that's how you could think of this here. There's a plurality of properties, but they're not parts, right? It's all those plurality at once in a unity. It seems insane, Frank. I feel like Frank, which I really appreciate, you've been bouncing back and forth between, oh, that makes sense, to, oh, this is insane, to, I can kind of get what Leibniz is saying, oh, it's insane, which is a good way to read a text. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Frank, we talked about that earlier. Yeah. In certain ways, like Leibniz's way of describing cause and effect is like not that the billiard ball hits the other one, but that they all have their own internal principles that they're following. But the internal principles include their relations to other things, right? So it's a weird way in which it is like it has to do with the two billiard balls relating to each other, but it's like they both internally were synced up in the right way to perceive each other. Theologically modal, yeah, source now. Yeah, right. This was Leibniz's history is that he grew up, his father died when he was like 2, but his father was a scholar, and so he had access to his library, so he had access to the library from a young age, and he was also kind of inspired by his lost father. And, in that, he had all the teachings of like scholastics, the church fathers, Aristotle, all that stuff. And then when he took a position as a royal advisor, he was able to go to France and to England. And there he, learned about the new mechanistic philosophy of Descartes and Hobbes and Spinoza. And then that was kind of a shock to him because he had this older kind of church-based background, and then he was into this new mechanistic philosophy. And in a lot of ways, I think you could think of his philosophy as the attempt to reconcile those two things. And struggling with it, as one might imagine, is a good way of describing it. Okay, here's where we get a lot of this stuff, like I said, is indirect attacks on usually either Descartes or Spinoza, but here's a direct one. But 14, this is a really important passage here. The passing state, which involves and represents a multitude in the unity or in the simple substance, is nothing other than what one calls perception, which should be distinguished from apperception or consciousness, as will be evident in what follows. Also very important for Kant. It says right there, apperception or consciousness. What the app does to add to the word perception is that you perceive yourself perceiving, right? That's the key thing there, right? You perceive yourself perceiving the thing you're perceiving, right? You see yourself in the mirror, right? This is the stage for the question of self-consciousness. But he's saying a simple substance has perception, not necessarily apperception. That's quite important. This is where the Cartesians have failed badly, since they took no account of the perceptions that we do not apperceive, right? They were thinking of perception only as apperceiving, only as consciousness. Ontologists, it's also retroactive. I noticed that the AC turned off. Yeah, I mean, I've seen an argument that that Leibniz prefigures like Freud or something like that. That there's a thinking of the unconscious in Leibniz, right? That there is this idea of perception without apperception, which you could think of potentially. This argument was that you could think of as the unconscious prefigured. Right, but it's also a way that, like, for instance, a change in the air temperature, causes the thermometer to go up or something, right? You could describe that as a perception rather than an apperception, right? It's about the relation between the two things. There doesn't need to be that element of self-consciousness there, right? Yeah, they're trying to rationalize something fundamentally noisy, right? They want everything to be harmonizing, and that's ultimately what the empiricists are kind of makes the empiricist rather than the rationalists is being resistant to the idea that you can find the rational principle to give harmony and organizing. Ontologist, well, it's that the AC noise turns off that I also know that I knew the AC was running the whole time. Sure, yeah. Well, that starts sounding like a little Heideggerian, like you don't notice the chair you're sitting in until the chair breaks, and when it stops working, suddenly it comes to vision. Yeah. Totally. Okay. So we get really cutting here. This is where the Cartesians have failed badly, since they took no account of the perceptions that we do not apperceive. This is also what made them believe that minds alone are monads, and that there are no animal souls or other entelechies. With the common people, they have confused a long stupor with death, properly speaking, which made them fall again into the scholastic prejudice of completely separated souls, and they have even confirmed unsound minds in the belief of the mortality of souls. So I researched this one a little bit. Leibniz addresses that at length in a letter he wrote. So because it's a letter and publishing, he's even more vicious, and he's really attacking Descartes. He's saying, Descartes is so popular now, but he's full of himself. He thinks he's a genius, but he's not. He's nothing like Aristotle, and he's popular now, but soon no one will even remember him. Right? He's really tearing Descartes apart. And this is one thing that he really goes in on, which is why I read the letter. I guess how Descartes explained memory, since for Descartes, right, the mind is the substance and then the body is the extension, right? How he explains memory, which is also important in the sense of the immortality of a soul, that even after your body dies, you could still have memory, right? Is that there's a certain way in which the grooves of the brain, almost like, as you would think about today, like a record, have the memories etched into them. But then what Leibniz basically says is, well, if that's the case, then once your body dies and the brain is gone, you will have lost all your memories. So don't even have a real conception of the immortality of souls, right? Because although Descartes says souls are mortal, Leibniz is suggesting that are immortal, right? Leibniz is suggesting he fails to really live up to that premise, because he's given things like memory that are supposed to be evidence of a soul's continuing across time. He's given them over to the material world that he's already denigrated as just extension. Are you referring, Frank, to the earlier reading from Heidegger? Immortality of souls is revealed as one of the goals of this philosophy. I think it is. I think that's one of the things that, like I was saying earlier, I think in a lot of ways, this is like, mathematical proof a proof in the mathematical sense, the geometric sense, really, for a lot of these theological beliefs. In terms of how Heidegger would think about it, he'd probably think of it as like more fundamental than that, right? The question of persistence across time is ultimately the question of being, you know? Okay, 15. The action of the internal principle which brings about the change or passage from one perception to another can be called appetition, right? That's like the same word as appetite. You could also think of it as desire, and it sometimes is called desire. Monads have an internal principle that brings about change within themselves and the passing of perception, and they also have desire, right? It is true that the appetite cannot always completely reach the whole perception toward which it tends, but it always obtains something of it and reaches new perceptions, right? We ourselves experience a multitude in a simple substance when we find that the least thought we ourselves apperceive involves variety in its object. Thus, all those who recognize that the soul is a simple substance should recognize this multitude in the monad, and Mr. Bayle should not find any difficulty in this, as he has done in his dictionary article Rorarius. So there's another moment. Leibniz is kind of seething over here because I haven't read it, but the footnote explains that this guy, Mr. Bayle, wrote a very critical article of Leibniz called Rorarius. Unfortunately, I haven't read it, so I can't really expand on this point here, but... And I've always said, fuck Mr. Bayle. Yes, exactly. I can see why some people might connect Leibniz to psychoanalysis with this point about desire. Yep. Yeah, there definitely has been points to suggest a link between psychoanalysis and Leibniz. And I think we've got a bunch of Deleuzians in the chat too. I mean, I think Deleuze kind of does as well, right? 17. Moreover, we must confess that the perception and what depends on it is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons. That is, through shapes and motions, right? And remember that, you know, if we were talking very simplistically, I talked earlier about how Leibniz is trying to reconcile this older philosophy that's basically Aristotle plus Christianized Aristotle and the new mechanistic philosophy that's all about, you know, laws and machines and necessary determined universe, right? He's trying to reconcile these two things. You could describe that newer view as the mechanical view and that older view as the organic view. Frank, I think even if I suffered from Leibniz's axioms, I would still explain a monad appearing to move and change as God perpetually destroying and creating new monads throughout the change, instead of deciding the monads contain the changes in themselves. The problem for Leibniz with that view, Frank, is what we're talking about, the infinite divisibility, right? If there's not some fundamental substance which is unchangeable, according to Leibniz, then the ground is nothingness, right? And, you know, you can't, according to Leibniz, again, I mentioned this in the Discord. I mean, obviously, you know, Heidegger and some like existentialists and some people later talk about, you know, in direct critique of Leibniz, the idea that no, that there can be the fundamental nothing or the absurd. But, you know, even in Leibniz's time, already in, right, you know, Eastern traditions like you know, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, you know, Nagarjuna, right? There's already a conception of the nothing as fundamental, right? But for Leibniz, that just doesn't make sense because, right, if you have nothing basically as fundamental, then you have zero. And you can't, it's not that if you have one as fundamental, then you can add the one and the one and the one together and you can have a substance built of three things. But if you add a zero and a zero and a zero, you still have zero, right? That's the real problem. It's also worth bearing in mind Heidegger's words earlier, that we should be considering what problems he's articulating here that make his philosophy meaningful and could potentially be meaningful again if we encounter similar problems. Yeah, completely agree, right? I think that's one of the problems that I want to avoid as we read Leibniz, right? That you could say like, oh, well, Leibniz philosophy is that we're all monads, and the monads are all made to interact by God, and they have perceptions of each other. But if you don't understand what problems Leibniz is trying to solve, then you miss the point. It sounds like he's just saying he's making shit up, but he's trying to answer certain problems. So it's crucial to try to answer those problems if we want to, or try to understand rather what those problems are, if we want to understand why he comes up with these ideas. So I could not agree with you more, Ravan. And yeah, he is trying to answer this problem that at least seems like a problem to him, right? That if you have a mechanistic philosophy, where you can explain everything in terms of parts and processes and engineering and systems, right? There has to be some fundamental thing building up those things, or the system would be incoherent because you'd be building it out of nothings, right? And that's why he's coming up with this idea of monads. Energy. I believe Zizek would argue against Leibniz on this point about nothingness because of the indeterminacy of existence, which comes from post-Kantian, post-critical epistemic lack. Yeah, it's a good use of the word I was talking about earlier, how Kant is so influential that there's a pre- and post-critical. And Leibniz is technically pre-critical, right? He's an influence on Kant, which is the critical turn. It is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons, the perception that each monad has. If we imagine that there is a machine whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, we could conceive it enlarged, keeping the same proportions, so that we could enter into it as one enters into a mill. Assuming that, when inspecting its interior, we will only find parts that push one another, and we will never find anything to explain a perception. Assuming that. And so, we should seek perception in the simple substance, and not in the composite or in the machine. Furthermore, this is all one can find in the simple substance, that is, perceptions and their changes. It is also in this alone that all the internal actions of simple substances can consist. Right, it's the Gundam paragraph, yeah, big up for windmill heads, yeah, right. So if we walked inside a machine whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, right? So in a certain sense, I guess Leibniz would also be opposed to systems theory or something like that. A perception cannot be just, if we were just machines, right, there would be nothing like perception. Because it, if we imagine a type of machine that we could actually walk inside, there's parts all working together, but there's nothing that creates the perception. In a certain way, even I guess Descartes knew that, right? Because even though he's got a mechanistic view of body, he has the pineal gland, the one spot in the brain, supposedly, where the mind comes in, and that's where you get perception from. I absolutely see that he's trying to reconcile new mechanistic stuff with God, but I think he's doing a silly, hand-wavy job of it when he could just say, yes, mechanics, but resting on God's back. I mean, I guess that he's responding to that kind of thing as being a deficiency in like Descartes and Spinoza. When we were reading the other one, that there has to be a reason for everything. It can't just be that the world is good because God made it, right? It's not that God made the world and the world was good because God made it. It's that God made the world and God saw his works and he saw that what he had made was good, right? Which for Leibniz means he knew that it had followed the rational reasons of goodness and harmony. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a good discussion. It's a good discussion, and it's also, yeah, I'm really happy. Thanks everyone for this great discussion we're having. There's a lot. This is really setting us up well, also for Kant. Well, so Leibniz's view, we're going to get there. God's at the end. We build up to God at the end. But basically, God is what makes all interaction happen between the Gundams. But we'll get there. One can call all simple substances or created monads entelechies, for they have in themselves a certain perfection. They have a sufficiency that makes them the sources of their internal actions, and so to speak, incorporeal automata. If we wish to call soul everything that has perceptions and appetites in the general sense I have just explained, then all simple substances or created monads can be called souls. But since sensation is something more than a simple perception, I think that the general name of monad and entelechy is sufficient for simple substances, which only have perceptions, and that we should only call those substances souls where perception is more distinct and accompanied by memory. An important thing to say here also, right? Soul, in Aristotle's sense, is sort of undefined at first because he's just saying soul is whatever gives things, makes things move, makes things alive. And what that is not defined in advance, but to discover what's at issue, or what causes that. Obviously, what happens when Aristotle becomes the philosopher in the medieval period is that many philosophers, like especially Aquinas, work very hard to figure out how to make what Aristotle means by soul and what Christian theology means by soul the same thing. So something worth keeping in the mind in the background of this. You like it again, Frank? Nice. I enjoy this winding journey you're on with Leibniz. An important part here also, right? So in a certain way, Leibniz is saying it depends on what we call soul, right? But he says that, right, that the Descartes and the Cartesians are all wrong for saying that only those who apperceive have souls. Basically, only humans have souls. Or sorry, only humans have perceptions, right? But only humans, Leibniz would probably say, have apperceptions. But all monads of any kind have perceptions. Right? And so he's saying it's probably fine to say only souls are only those substances which have apperception and memory. It's also a kind of side note. John Locke, the empiricist, one of the debates that's also kind of happening at this time, although it's kind of in some ways a bigger problem for the empiricists, is personal identity, right? How do I, even despite the fact that, every 7 years or whatever the statistic is, all my cells have changed and everything, I'm still me. I'm still Luminance Bloom. How do I preserve that over material changes? John Locke's answer is memory, right? I'm me because I remember having been me. I have all my memories with me. I think that's kind of a relevant parallel here. 20. For we experience within ourselves a state in which we remember nothing and have no distinct perception. This is similar to when we faint or when we are overwhelmed by a deep, dreamless sleep. In this state, the soul does not differ sensibly from a simple monad. But since this state does not last, and since the soul emerges from it, our soul is something more. This becomes a big... that's another case where it's relevant to remember the debate, so I'm actually glad I brought the Locke thing up there, right? Because Locke has to deal with that as well. Like, so are you not really you anymore when you're sleeping if you're, not remembering accurately what happened? Of course, Descartes gives the example of when I sleep, I feel like it's real life, but then it turns out it's not. So how do I know when I think I'm awake, I'm not asleep as well, right? Sleep's an important problem in this era of philosophy to deal with. But I guess for Leibniz, when we sleep, we are more like a simple monad, but we still recognize ourselves emerging from it. Well, sure, Frank, but the position is not that there's no difference between me at 20 and 80, but it's that I am still me, right? It's how is it that you can have change, right, but still be you, right? I mean, you could say no. I mean, Hume does, basically. Hume says we're just a bundle of perceptions. It's an illusion that our identity exists over time. Ontologist, you're a successor to yourself? Yeah, that's kind of... That's interesting because that's kind of like Hume's view, but then it kind of still has an idea of don't know what you want to call it, historicity or something. You're a successor to your prior self. Frank, the name luminance bloom hasn't changed, but is referring to something with totally different composition and properties. So would you say, Frank, that it's a illusion or a mistake to think that I, luminance bloom, am 15-year-old luminance bloom? It's an interesting question. And it does not at all follow. So interesting. Well, yeah, that's the Humean position, right? But many people are not comfortable with that. Don't take issue with that. But you can bite the bullet and say, yeah. Well, but is that what it means to say, Frank, that I am me? Is that you expect different reactions? I mean, maybe. So your view is that identity is predictive, basically. What I mean by saying that someone is Frank is that I have a certain predictive accuracy about what kinds of things you will say to me if I say X, Y, or Z to you. Interesting. Ontologist, more so as in an ordinal. Some ordinals contain other ordinals, some ordinals don't. My 15-year-old doesn't contain my 40-year-old self. I see what you mean, right? That it's, yeah, well, that's like, there's, Marion, I mean, that's not quite what you have, but Jean-Luc Marion, the phenomenologist, has a whole thing about, your flesh bearing history, right? History is in your flesh, so to speak. That kind of reminds me of that a little bit. Energy, if it's about predictiveness, I'd say it's too behaviorist for me. An AI performing Frank big time well enough is also Frank big time. Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, energy. I mean, that basically is a kind of a behaviorist, right? You are who you are because of predictivity about your behavior. It's a really interesting and quite radical take, Frank. Although it's interesting to me you say that, because that feels, earlier you were saying it's silly to say that two mugs that are identical are the same just because they have the same properties. Now you're saying that an AI, which wouldn't even have all the same properties as you, but just that performs you well enough, would be you. Maybe you've been convinced by Leibniz. In my opinion, Raven says, for Leibniz, the concept luminance boom undergoes change while keeping its proper name in the created world. But for God, it's unchanging because the whole series of changes, perceptions are apprehended all at once, and creation explains your internal difference. Yeah, I mean, well said. I think that's how Leibniz would see it. Yeah, that's from the vision of God, right? We haven't got to this yet, but this is, again, how you'll see how this is really influential on Kant, right? All the monads perceive each other, and that perception produces relations in space and in time. But from the view of God, from the purely objective view, there's no such thing as that kind of time, right? All time is all at once. I think you're totally right in terms of how Leibniz would respond to that. Frank says, if you can't tell them apart because they've left your active perception, there's no sense in which mug A is a continuation of mug A and B is a continuation of B. So you're getting even more radical now, Frank. You're saying that if I can't anymore tell which one's which, there's not only are they not the same, there's no mug A or mug B anymore. Is that what you're saying? There's now like A prime and B prime. I like this, Frank. You're this is quite a radical positions you're developing in response to Leibniz. I like this. Okay, let's keep reading the text. If I don't get back soon, I think I'm gonna have to add a death to the death counter. It does not at all follow that in such a state, the simple substance is without any perception. This is not possible for the previous reasons, for it cannot perish, and it also cannot subsist without some property, which is nothing other than its perception, right? right? Remember that substances, monads, do not perish, right? Nothing is ever created or destroyed, right? There's just new compositions, new composites of simple substances, but simple substances exist forever, according to Leibniz, right? It cannot perish. And if it subsists, it has some property, right? Which is its perception, right? So this is kind of in the logical argument. This is why monads have to have perceptions, because all monads must exist. So they need perception as a property. But when there is a great multitude of small perceptions in which nothing is distinct, we are stupefied. This is similar to when we continually spin in the same direction several times in succession, from which arises a dizziness that can make us faint and does not allow us to distinguish anything. Death can impart this state to animals for a time. That's an interesting kind of side comment here. Death for animals is like when you spin too much and you get dizzy. Death, really the only thing that happens in death is not that we lose perception, right? Our monads still have perception, right? But there are so many small perceptions in which nothing is distinct that we can't make it out. I guess because we're being rearranged into new composites. Is that why? I think. 22. And since every present state of a simple substance is a natural consequence of its preceding state, the present is pregnant with the future. That actually sounds quite Heideggerian, which is kind of Kantian in a way, right? The way in which past and future are meaningful, i.e. that past isn't just the presence that came before, and the future isn't just the presence yet to come, is that past and present are actively past and future are actively inside of the present, right? Yeah, exactly. Should be withdrawn, but still there, right? That everything that we are is also kind of like what Ontologist was saying earlier, right? Like every state I am is a succession of the me's before, right? Every state is a consequence of its preceding state, and in some sense it has that history inside of it, and at the same time we're moving on this progression, right? It's pregnant with the future. Every state I am projects toward where I'm going. Quite Heideggerian. Raven, I think it's because our force appetite is receding, such that perceptual selection becomes less and less precise, more and more obscure. That makes sense. Desire clarifies things, right? We have a certain desire which pushes us towards focusing on some things rather than others, which gives us some drive. And as we lose desire, everything comes back. That makes sense. That's compelling, Raven. I think you're right. The present is pregnant with the future is also a common Marxian motif, with each mode of production is pregnant with the roots of its own downfall. Absolutely, right? Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that's, right, that's, Marx's kind of, the flip, the standing, people get the quote wrong, they say flip Hegel on his head. Actually, what Marx said was to stand Hegel on his feet, right? Because he thought by being an idealist, Hegel had stood on his head, right? But yeah, this, the dialectical element is here as well, and Hegel, of course, is hugely Kantian, and if Kant gets it from Leibniz, that's itself an example of what we're talking about here. Yeah. Therefore, since on being awakened from a stupor, we apperceive our perceptions, right? So when we wake up from sleep, we perceive our perceptions self-consciously. It must be the case that we had some perceptions immediately before, even though we did not apperceive them. For a perception can only come naturally from another perception, as emotion can only come naturally from emotion. So I guess this is his argument to the sleep question, right? That when we wake up, we do have some experience of perceiving, and if every perception relies on some prior perception to cause a future one, then we can know that we were perceiving when we were asleep, even though we're not aware of it now. Latvian Jesus, I also see Deleuze's potential to be different is to find those possibilities not yet known. Yeah, totally. From this, we see that if, in our perceptions, we had nothing distinct or, so to speak, in relief and stronger in flavor, we would always be in a stupor. And this is the state of bare monads. Bare monads are basically always asleep. I guess because they don't have this stronger desire. 25. We also see that nature has given heightened perceptions to animals from the care she has taken to furnish them organs that collect several rays of light or several waves of air in order to make them more effectual by bringing them together. There is something similar to this in odor, taste, and touch, and perhaps in many other senses which are unknown to us. I will soon explain how what occurs in the soul represents what occurs in the organs. It's also relevant, right? Aristotle made Aristotle, this is all about substances. He's figuring out what the organic substances of the world are. So he does lots of categorizing. Reading Aristotle is like reading a list of categories and tables, right? He makes a distinction between living and non-living things. Non-living, I believe he breaks up into natural, like rocks, and artifacts, like a chair. And then living, he breaks up into plants, animals, and humans. And that's so, there's kind of that question is being at work here. The question of how animals have more than just like the stupor of a plant or something, but less than a human or something. And that's not only frames the question then of in Leibniz's time, but the question for us now, because of course that's something that people work on now and challenge, largely critically, challenging the idea that there is this hierarchy that splits humans from animals. And also that's problem number one for us today. Problem number two is also a kind of disability position from which it's criticized for to be human relies on a certain conception of ability or capacity that is, many in that tradition would argue inherently ableist. So those are some of those ways in which this old problem we can both understand, like Heidegger was talking about, the problem in its time as it was a problem for Leibniz, and how we can, by understanding that problem in Leibniz's time for Leibniz, bring it forward to the present to think about it in our time. 26. Memory, Raven says, it's hard where you really have to wonder what aggregates of monads mean. Are these organs monads too? And the muscles and the blood vessels, etc.? Right? The body without organs. Yeah, right. I think so for Leibniz. Well, they're probably composite. You're right. It's a hard question. I was thinking there's one of the things that that Leibniz also critiques Descartes on is that he thinks Descartes has a bad argument for how the pumping of blood works in the body. So that might be worth checking out. I might look that up after where organs sit on the simple composite dichotomy. Monads with gonads, absolutely. Now that would be an interesting one, the gonadology. That'd be like Bataillean version of Leibniz. Latvian Jesus, who's human anymore anyways. Yeah, you could also have a kind of just rejection of the category of the human, full stop. Memory provides a kind of sequence in souls. Frank, the idea of a kidney is a monad, but the kidney itself is a composite. Yeah, I guess, so monads, this is the hard thing. Monads are one-dimensional, right? So in a certain way, you could say they're kind of like ideas. But he really wants to, but remember that Descartes does think explicitly. Like, what's real are the ideas, which are one-dimensional, and then you add additional dimensions, you get bodies. But of course, those additional dimensions are just nothing above and beyond. Whereas, but the problem is that makes body, like for Leibniz, it's also kind of like there's a fundamental thing. It's like kind of like an idea, but also the body has the idea actively in it. You can't separate them. That's the problem he has with Descartes. Ontology says the point of monads is that it's the stopping point for infinite division of substance. Yeah, exactly. Right. That's the problematic that he's fundamental. Like we can talk all about the whole system he builds out of monads, but the reason he does that, right, is to respond to this problem of infinite divisibility, right? Which, as Leibniz frames it, there cannot be infinite divisibility. So memory is what links together the pictures on the film strip. Memory provides a kind of sequence in souls, which imitates reason, but which must be distinguished from it. That's interesting, right? So memory imitates reason. It's like reason, but it's kind of the fake of reason. It's the illusory reason. We observe that when animals have the perception of something which strikes, and also I should say, right, Aristotle, that is the distinction between animals and humans. Animals have, like plants and humans, the desire to reproduce and grow. They also have, which plants don't have according to Aristotle, the desire to move around, motility. But what humans have those two things also, is reason. So that's kind of what Leibniz seems to be responding to here, right? Maybe animals have memory, but memory is only the imitation of reason, which only humans have reason. We observe that when animals have the perception of something which strikes them, and when they previously had a similar perception of that thing, then through a representation in their memory, they expect that which was attached to the thing in the preceding perception and are led to have sensations similar to those they had before. For example, if we show dogs a stick, they remember the pain that it caused them and they flee. That's actually a more detailed explanation of this than I've seen before, for how is it, clearly it does seem like, right, dogs can think. So if you want to be one of these philosophers that say, only humans can think, so to speak, how do you explain a dog's ability to associate the stick with pain or whatever? And he has an answer, which is they have memory, but memory is only I guess a perception rather than an apperception. So actually you can see how this is relevant to Kant as well, since there's this real question in Kant, this real importance of not just consciousness, but self-consciousness. Frank, how do we know that dogs don't think about God? Leibniz just sort of declares it here. Yeah, that's another thing, right? I mean, in here where, again, it's like that's just taken for granted, right? Aristotle said that humans have self-consciousness, or they have reason, and the animals don't. And the axiom is to prove what we're already taking for granted, right? Yeah, it's true. He just declares it, really. He takes it for granted and then tries to explain it. 27. And the strong imagination that strikes and moves them comes from the magnitude or the multitude of the preceding perceptions. For often a strong impression produces, all at once, the effect produced by a long habit or by many lesser, reiterated perceptions. 28. Men act like beasts insofar as the sequence of their perceptions results from the principle of memory alone. They resemble the empirical physicians who practice without theory. We are all mere empirics in 3/4 of our actions. For example, when we expect that the day will dawn tomorrow, we act like an empiric, because until now it has always been thus. Only the astronomer judges this by reason. I don't know if that's what the footnote says, but Hume says that, right? That the only reason we know that the sun will come up tomorrow is because we've seen it happen every day. It's a force of habit. I mean, this must be a reference to Hume, right? And that's Hume kind of biting the empiricism bullet and really, rejecting that we have any way to establish an absolute law of cause and effect through rationality, right? We just know that it's probably going to happen again because it happened so many times before, but we can't have any more meaningful knowledge than that. Also doesn't imply a contradiction, so it's a matter of fact. Yeah. And a matter of fact also, on this technical definition, means, yeah, something empirical, right? A purely logical truth, like Pythagoras' theorem, is not a fact, right? It's not that you go out and prove it, right? It holds. Versus, the sun, we can imagine the sun not rising, but the point is that it does, so it's a fact. Okay, no, this is actually, the footnote tells us the empirics were a sect of physicians from, I guess, ancient Rome. Interesting. Nonetheless, it sounds absolutely like Hume. I was thinking, is there any Bloodborne players in the chat? This will mean nothing to you unless you like Bloodborne and know Bloodborne lore, but I kind of think of I have a headcanon that the Healing Church are the empiricists, and the Bergenworth is the rationalists, which so Leibniz would be the rationalists who want to close what is it, eyes on the inside. That makes me think of this, talking about men acting like beasts. Sorry if no one plays Bloodborne in here. That's a complete meaningless comment. But Frank, I haven't played, but I'm a sort of honorary player because I've watched Prof play. Wow, I was gonna say I assumed you were a Bloodborne player because I know you're in Prof's chat. That's impressive. I would have assumed you played. That's really interesting that you have played but not watched. That's really interesting. Or the other way around. Watched but not played. Very interesting. Anyway, okay. Let's keep going. But the knowledge of eternal and necessary truths is what distinguishes us from simple animals and furnishes us with reason and the sciences, by raising us to a knowledge of ourselves and of God. And this is what we call the rational soul, or mind, in ourselves. We've got this whole thing here, right? We've talked about, how animals have memory, which is like reason, but not true reason, according to Leibniz. And then men can kind of act like animals insofar as they can have perceptions that result from memory alone, right? And in fact, actually, so basically, this is kind of a subtle own, isn't it, of like the empiricists. Like Hume is more like an animal than a human because he just has memory of the sun. He doesn't have a reason of why the sun rises. The eternal and necessary truths is reason and the sciences, by raising us to a knowledge of ourselves and of God. It is also through the knowledge of necessary truths and through their abstractions that we rise to reflective acts. Again, this is going to be huge for Kant, right? Reflection, right? The thinking which thinks not only of what you're thinking about, but sees yourself seeing yourself, right? Which enables us to think of that which is called I, and enable us to consider that this or that is in us. And thus, in thinking of ourselves, we think of being, of substance, of the simple and the composite, of the immaterial and of God himself, by conceiving that which is limited in us is limitless in him. And these reflective acts furnish the principal objects of our reasoning. That's also going to be an important point that Kant's going to respond to later, right? Because remember that critique is about setting limits, but God is supposed to be limitless. That's going to be very important later. Oh, cool. For VR, that's awesome. Cool. Awesome. Love it, Riviera. Yeah, let me know when you stream. I want to be there. I get why Leibniz thinks reason is separate from acting on memory, but it's another thing he doesn't actually defend. Right. But he's actually going to do a little bit here. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is, a reasoning by proof, where the proof involves a lot of axioms that we just assume, right? Very accurate thing about, for better or for worse, about Leibniz. Our reasonings are based on two great principles, that of contradiction in virtue of which we judge that which involves a contradiction to be false, and that which is opposed or contradictory to the false to be true, right? So reason has this principle that already is all the way back in Aristotle, right? That you can't have P and not P. It either is raining or it isn't raining. Of course, there's like Noah's friend, Graham Priest. There's people that working today, logicians, who deny that you need the law of contradiction, that you can have dialetheism, right? Statements where a statement and its contradiction is true. But generally speaking, going back to Aristotle and the foundations of logic, and Leibniz certainly accepts this, one of the most basic fundamental rules you have to have for logic is that the law of contradiction, right? Two statements that contradict each other cannot both be true. One has to be false. 69. Only those who understand monads, by which I mean agree that monadology is correct, are functioning by true reasoning. Yeah, exactly. The truest reason is the one who agrees with me. You either have to pee or not. Exactly, Tendarius. Exactly. Second great principle is the one I alluded to earlier, the principle of sufficient reason. And in fact, I regularly make a joke because this is a philosophy speedruns, PSR, which is also the acronym of principle of sufficient reason. PSR is the principle of sufficient streaming. And that of sufficient reason, by virtue of which we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise, although most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us. This is potentially wading into some, because this is complex in Leibniz, but to ignore for right now a little bit of the complexities, a certain way of saying it is that any assertion is necessary, right? The opposite of necessary would be contingent, right? There's no particular reason why things are the way they are. But Leibniz has a little more complex thing about necessary and contingency. But, this is in a certain way the deterministic universe of mechanistic philosophy, right? That everything follows necessary laws. There are also two kinds of truths, those of reasoning and those of fact. The truths of reasoning are necessary and their opposite is impossible, right? The truths of fact are contingent and their opposite is possible, right? So there's the exact thing I was just talking about, right? The truths of reasoning are necessary, right? It's not that a square circle could be possible, but we just don't find one in nature. You cannot even conceive of a square circle, but you can conceive of me dropping my mug and it flying upward, right? And you can see it in science fiction movies. It's just not what happens. So it's a contingent truth. When a truth is necessary, its reason can be found by analysis, resolving it into simpler ideas and simpler truths until we reach the primitives. Right, which is kind of what you get in something like Wittgenstein's Tractatus, where you take any logical proposition and you keep breaking it down until you get to the atomic facts, the core set of possible relationships that exist, that are necessary and possible. Energy asks, does necessity, contingency correlate to analytic, synthetic, or no? For those who don't know, that has to do with Kant. It's important in Kant, right? An analytic truth is something that is contained in the concept itself, versus synthetic is something you have to go out and discover about the concept through a kind of synthesis. Of course, as we'll get to when we get to Kant, but we'll save that for another day, Kant adds another layer of complexity on that, where he distinguishes between a priori and a posteriori of analytic and synthetic truths, because the conventional view would be that analytic truths are a priori, They're before experience, and then synthetic truths are after, whereas Kant thinks there actually are some a priori synthetic truths, but that's getting a little ahead for now. Because of that, I mean, I don't think there's that aspect going on here in Leibniz, but if you ignore the a priori and a posteriori aspect here, maybe you could say that. I mean, either way, it's definitely related energy. It's definitely related. And also, this is why it's called an analytic truth, right? He is saying that you can find it by analysis. But rather than synthetic here, he uses speculative, right? It's definitely related. One way or another, they're very related. Yeah, exactly, Tindarius. That's the concern here. Shane, the squared circle is just wrestling. I can envision that pretty easily. Can you? A squared circle? Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Yeah. I am hitting my limits. We've got 2 minutes till we have to call Kant class for today. I think I've hit my limit there. So that's actually a good place to stop. So let me put that in our notes. We've got 2 types of truths. Analytic, which is necessary, and contingent. Or sorry, rather, analytic and sorry, no, I'm using the Kant terms. Reasoning, though it does seem to map onto analytic, and fact, which is contingent, right? And we're going to go into next time, next Sunday, we're going to go into that. So, thanks everyone. This was a really awesome first stream. Really amazing discussions. Thanks to everyone who was here. Thanks to, longtime friends like Frank and Shane, and thanks for the raid, Shane and Tindarios and Rodurden and Riviera and Sochnow and Ontologist, and thanks to all new friends that have joined us. Raven, Latvian Jesus, Cinesemiotics, scrolling through the chat. Some people were here and not anymore. Go Mobo, Bless Your Guts. Thanks everyone. This was really awesome. Please, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Go Mobo. That's awesome. I enjoyed y'all being here. Olive Minerva 25. Thanks for being here. Clawbra, I was looking for your name because I remembered you, but I couldn't remember exactly how you spelled it. Thanks for the follow, Gomobo. We will be back next Sunday. It's every Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. California time, 10 p.m. Central Europe time. If you're in Australia and you're here, I'm impressed because I think it's like 4 a.m. your time or anywhere in that area of the world. Also, this Thursday there will not be a stream, but there usually will be a poetry stream on Thursdays. Next time we will finish the Monadology. So again, as you saw, we'll do it on screen, so you don't have to do any reading outside of class, so to speak. But if you want to, you can finish the Monadology, and you can both bring your thoughts to stream next time and or throw them in the chat.